For more on the U.S. Middle East policy, we are joined by a big panel. In Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland, a senior fellow and director of Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. In Riyadh, we invited Salman al-Ansari, the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. In Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, a professor at the Tehran University. Last but not least, Li Guofu, director of the Center for Middle East Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Certainly begin with you, Mr. Eland. What exactly is the U.S. looking at when President said withdraw ASAP? Well, then the Secretary of Defense quit. Then Secretary of State and National Security Advisor took their turn, all rushed to the Middle East. What exactly is going on?
Well, what's going on is gross incompetence by the president. He's a person who doesn't have any prior government experience, and he's also very impulsive. So he wants to get out of Syria. So he just said, let's do it. Well, of course, after his defense secretary resigned and the coordinator, the anti-ISIS coordinator resigned, he then, I think, got a little wake-up call when his advisors were saying, well, we have to do it slower because otherwise the Turks will overrun the Kurds. It'll cause all these problems. Iran will gain an influence. And, of course, his main policy, as you point out, is stopping Iran. Well, if you withdraw from Syria, that's going to have the opposite effect. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan of staying in Syria, but it's a contradiction of his own policy. So I don't believe he realized that.
But on the other hand, Professor Marandi, since Iran, the name is being mentioned, I need to go to you, sir. Over the years, is the current administration having more conflicting of goals, if you look at from outside, about the Middle East than the previous administrations? 2001, the war against terrorism, quote unquote, started after September 11th. Then a real war taking place in Iraq. After that, so-called war fighting against ISIS, and in a way making good terms with Iran. But then U.S. withdraw from JCPOA, and now withdraw even from Syria, but then also maybe not. So can you tell from your perspective, Professor Marandi, what has been this strategic goal if people are diminishing what President Trump is trying to do here, which is quote unquote lack of strategic goal for the U.S. as a whole?
The United States has, over the past few decades, has been doing very many inconsistent acts in the region. On the one hand, it used to support Saddam Hussein, then it invaded and destroyed the country. It supported the extremists in Afghanistan. In fact, Brzezinski, before he died, admitted that even before the Soviet invasion, the Americans were supporting them in order to encourage a Soviet invasion to create their own Vietnam. Then later on, of course, after 9/11, they went and attacked Al-Qaeda and they overthrew the Taliban. Then in Yemen, in Syria and in Libya, alongside regional countries, they supported the same Al-Qaeda that carried out attacks on New York. We know this from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that was partially released, and that the United States knew its regional allies were supporting these groups. So these inconsistencies have been going on, and now, as your previous guest rightly pointed out, while the United States presence in Syria is illegal, but on the one hand, Trump states one policy and then suddenly he states another policy, and even now we're not quite sure if the United States is going to pull out, because Trump's statements seem to be inconsistent with those of Bolton and Pompeo.
Right. Oh, well, you have two guests already expressed their views. We certainly should have the other two also make their voice heard. Mr. Al-Ansari, of course, Saudi Arabia has been an ally of the United States despite some of the recent drama going on between the two countries. But to you, the Saudis, what exactly is the strategic goal that you can tell of not only the current White House, but also of Washington as a whole in the Middle East, let's just say over the past 10 to 15 years?
Shishia Weishian. I think overall Saudi-US relationship is still strong, still to be a relationship that is historic and important for the region and the security of the world. With regards to the topics that you guys discussed with regards to Syria, I think Saudi Arabia is very concerned with what's going on in Syria. It's a war that has produced one of the most humanitarian crises in the world. And I think it's very important for us to look at the complexity of Syria and to not just go with the mainstream media, which just go and attack the President of the United States. I think the President of the United States has done some tactical moves within Syria. I think overall, Iran and Turkey have swallowed the bait. I say so because with Twitter diplomacy, Trump proved to the world that Iran and Turkey were not good partners with regards to helping the Syrian people, because the moment he tweeted about withdrawing, even though I think that I do not take it at face value because it was tactical, Trump only has 2,000 soldiers within Syria, specifically in the eastern part of the Euphrates, and with 15 US bases over there. So I do not think that there will be a complete withdrawal. Let's imagine, or let's assume that he will withdraw 90% of the soldiers, of the troops on the ground. It will be 200 people spread it around 15 bases. This will be symbolic to the people because people will not, and countries will not be able to attack any of these bases or any of the territories that are controlled by the US. So overall, I think Turkey and Iran should get back to their senses and should not make the crisis in Syria worse.
Okay, let me go to also Mr. Lee. We see the other three gentlemen describing what they consider from their own perspective as important about what the US should do in Syria or the Middle East, without really helping us understand much about what they see as the US strategic goal demonstrated by the US words and the US actions so far. Mr. Lee, can you help us in that regard?
I think, generally speaking, President Trump now is following the former President Obama's strategy towards the Middle East. And let's say that they strategically withdraw from the Middle East. And Mr. Trump, because he has long time as a businessman, so it is very convenient for him to calculate what is important for the Americans in terms of economic benefits, like what he said.
Okay, so you are saying the key words is economic benefits. That will be the strategic goal of the United States. That's what you're saying.
But that's the President Trump's, what he calculated American interests.
As you see it, of course. He didn't say it. You see. So what exactly is the current action likely to help him in that regard?
I think, soon after his announcement, then he found that very strong reactions, not only from his own administrations, his aides, but from the whole international community, from the Europeans, from the airlines in the Middle East.
And therefore,
so he walks a little bit back in order to ease the worries of his friends, as well as maybe give the warning to his enemies in the region.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lee. You're giving behavioral analysis of President Trump of the United States. I'm not sure whether I would be very confident of taking everything you said as if that is exactly his logic. Mr. Eland, I wonder if you would do, on the other hand, what exactly is the key word that you would put for the United States when it comes to its interest, the strategic interest in the Middle East? We see Mr. Lee say economic benefits. You also see Mr. Al-Ansari suggesting about allied relationship. Well, also you heard from Professor Morandi suggesting there has never been a clear strategy anyway over the years, and it's contradicting toward one another. What do you say, Mr. Eland? What exactly is the strategic goal if you could put it into common English language?
Well, before Trump, I think it was get oil supplies, and support Israel. And I think to some extent that's still the policy, even though, of course, the U.S. is, with the fracking and all, is a lot less dependent on Middle Eastern oil. But, of course, that two-pronged policy was probably flawed in the first place, because the market, the oil market in the world, will provide oil at the cheapest prices. That was the government thinking. In Trump's era, I think it's going after Iran because they're an enemy of Israel, and I also think he may be cozying up to the Saudis, perhaps even for personal business interests. I can't prove that, but there's a lot of indications that that may be the case. So certainly we've had an alliance with Saudi Arabia, but I think it's probably time. I agree that we've been strategically muddled, not only in the Trump era, but even before that. And I think we really ought to look at our Middle Eastern policy, and I think it's much too interventionist. I'm not sure any of this is strategic to the United States security.
Very interesting. When you talk about the strategy, you could also look at the words that's said by the current administration. White House senior officials lost no time recently reassuring their allies in the Middle East. Here's John Bolton, the President's National Security Advisor, said.
We're going to be discussing the President's decision to withdraw, but to do so from northeast Syria in a way that makes sure that ISIS is defeated and is not able to revive itself and become a threat again, and to make sure that the defense of Israel and our other friends in the region is absolutely assured.
That's John Bolton, of course, National Security Advisor. After him, the State Secretary of State also going to the Middle East. Professor Morandi, come to you. I mean, the big part of why the U.S. still remain in Syria is because they are afraid, quote, Iran's invasion into the country and also muddling into the affairs of Syria, end of quote. But if you look at the overall picture of the U.S. strategic goal toward Iran, this should be more than just President Trump vis-a-vis President Obama. So how do you read the current administration and the current Washington's attitude toward Iran? And how does Iran, as a result, look at the current logic Washington is dealing with the region?
Well, Iran only entered Syria because of the extremist groups that countries like the United States and Saudi Arabia, among others, were funding. And the Wahhabi groups were a threat to the country. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, all of these groups had the same ideology as that of the Saudi regime. And therefore, since the fighting has died down and the Syrian government has retaken almost all territory except for that area occupied by the United States, and part in Idlib, which is still occupied by Al-Qaeda and other affiliates. The Iranians, their presence in the country has declined. But the United States is in a very difficult position because its presence in Syria, as I said earlier, is not only illegal, but it's also completely unacceptable to Turkey. It is very expensive because the Americans have to fly everything into the country, and it creates tensions with a very powerful, important country like Turkey. And Turkey and Iran are moving much closer to each other today, especially after what the Saudis did to Jamal Khashoggi and cutting him up alive in the consulate in Istanbul, and the Saudi and Emirati support.
So you are not necessarily answering my question, I'm afraid, Professor Morandi. I'm asking you about how Iran is exactly looking at the U.S. actions and try to figure out what the U.S. strategic goal is. You are telling me one after another phenomena which has already been recorded into the news anyway. So tell me about your analysis, if you can, sir.
Well, as I was saying, Iran sees itself in a much more enhanced and stronger position because Syria has regained its strength. Turkey has moved much closer to Iran. Iraq is a much stronger country today.
I see.
So the United States is not in an ideal position in Syria. It's in its own interest, in my opinion, that the United States pulls out of Syria and Afghanistan. But I think that the United States is in a tough position, because as you said at the beginning of the program, the Americans have relied a lot on the Saudi regime, the Saudi Mohammed bin Salman, because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's been discredited, and the famine in Yemen has become a big issue in the Western media, partially because of Trump's close relationship with him. And therefore, it's made it much more difficult for Trump to find room for maneuver, especially when the people who are working with him, like Pompeo and Bolton, seem to have very different policies from the president himself.
Right, exactly. Mr. Eland, would you like to respond to that? You see a mixture, seems, in the current White House, whether it's a hawkish, at least he has that brand name, Mr. Bolton, or a relatively in the middle Secretary Pompeo, both come out and go against President Trump's earlier statement about withdrawal ASAP from Syria. But the question really is Syria that big an issue for the United States in the Middle East? Does it really matter that much to the U.S. national interest? That is a key question, isn't it? It's only one of those phenomena of previous policies that the Trump administration has to inherit right now.
Yes, I think we've inherited the idea that every country in the world is strategic. I mean, Syria is strategic for Israel, and I think that's probably why U.S. policy is, why the U.S. is still meddling around in there. I favor getting out, and I favor getting out Trump's original statement, getting out faster the better, because I just don't see that Syria is strategic to the United States. And it's always been a friend of Russia, so I anticipated that Russia might do something if it could to help out Assad. So that doesn't surprise me. And I think we're being... the only thing we're doing after we've decimated ISIS is trying to keep Iran down. And very frankly, if we wanted to keep Iranian influence down, we should have never invaded Iraq in the first place. And that would have, tended to reduce or at least contain Iranian influence. But Iran is doing what it's doing because it wants to influence other countries in the region, just as the Saudis and everybody else do.
All right. Well, the war already happened. It is a water poured out, and you would never be able to return it back, unfortunately, according to history. Mr. Ansari, Saudi Arabia as an ally has been repeatedly mentioned in the analysis of the other gentlemen, but the question is, Saudi also want to have its own identity and its own strong regional presence as a regional player in the region. So now the U.S. policy has been switching. How do you think Saudi Arabia next step will be doing? Briefly, sir.
Allow me just to comment about what Mr. Mirandi has said. Because
can you do it briefly also, because you were doing some back and forth. So let's focus on the main points. Go ahead, sir.
Definitely. But he tried to project Iran as if it's Finland or New Zealand. I think he should get the facts right, because Al-Qaeda leaders are still harbored in Iran. And no one can deny this, and the Treasury Department has talked about this multiple times. With regards to the long-term strategy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is nothing but two things: prosperity and security. And Saudi Arabia wants to take that role to help all the neighboring countries to prosper and to also have a safe and secured nations. We do not allow the Iranian regime, which is a radical regime, to infiltrate through its proxies, either the Houthis or Hezbollah, which is considered to be international terror group. We do not allow the Iranians to play the game of the right and the left. Rouhani is the moderate, and Khamenei is the extremist or whatever. They are all the same people, and they want to have an unstable Middle East, and we will push back with our partners, specifically the United States, to push back with against the aggression of the radical Iranian regime, because we did not see any positive.
We see a lot of. We'll give you hours, and the result is still the same. There are a lot of finger-pointing accusations against one another, but one thing is very important. We are here for a reasonable debate about what exactly is the strategy that you see it as the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. Mr. Lee, before we go, very briefly from you as well, your final analysis before we take on to the next part of our discussion, Mr. Lee.
I think, we talk about the importance of Syria. As President Trump said that, the Syria itself is not very important for Americans. As he said that, Syria is full of sad and death. But Syria is the linchpin of the geopolitics in the Middle East.
I see.
Any change of the Syria probably would tilt the favor or the balance of power in the region. That's the main reason why Syria is important to every players in the region or outside.
We'll see how that balance is likely to be kept with all the players in the region and certainly beyond. No matter what it is, thank you so much, gentlemen, the four of you, for coming over to the program and be able to talk about your analysis from your own perspective. We certainly understand a lot of arguments going on in different sides about differences, but certainly it's very important to have some good analysis as well about the policy. Thank you so much, Ivan Eland, Salman Al-Ansari, Mohammed Randi, last but not least, Li Guofu. Thank you, really appreciate it.